You walk slowly into a world where silence feels older than memory itself, where the earth has not yet learned the meaning of boundaries or stone defenses. Tonight, you are not just listening to history. You are drifting through the earliest breath of civilization, where everything is soft, undefined, and quietly waiting to become something more. And perhaps nothing ever moves in a hurry here, not even time itself. You begin to notice the landscape of the Fertile Crescent unfolding around you, stretching like a gentle crescent-shaped cradle across ancient earth. Rivers move through it slowly, the Tigris and Euphrates gliding across wide lowlands like patient lines drawn by an unseen hand. Small communities rest near the water, scattered like quiet thoughts across a vast and sleeping land. And someone nearby might jokingly say even the wind seems too polite to rush. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. If you would like, leave a comment and tell us where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world, as if we are sharing the same quiet night across distant lands. Now, slowly dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You continue walking through this ancient environment where there are no cities as you would recognize them, only scattered settlements shaped by necessity rather than design. People here live close to the earth, depending on small fields of grain and herds that move slowly across the land. Everything feels temporary, as if even the ground itself has not yet decided what it wants to become. You notice that there are no borders drawn in stone or marked by authority. Instead, space flows naturally between groups of people, like water finding its way through open land. A settlement might fade into another without warning, and no one seems concerned about where one place ends and another begins. Even modern maps would feel confused here, as if someone forgot to give them instructions. In this quiet world, authority is not held in palaces or fortresses, but in the presence of elders and the soft influence of temple spaces. Leadership feels more like guidance than command, and decisions seem to rise slowly, like dust settling after wind. It is almost humorous to imagine modern meetings happening here, because everything would probably take 3 days just to begin. You walk closer to one of these small communities, where people gather near simple structures made of mud brick and reeds. There is a rhythm to their daily life that feels almost musical, though no instruments are present. Grain is measured by hand, water is carried in clay vessels, and conversations move at the same unhurried pace as the river nearby. Far in the distance, the Tigris and Euphrates continue their long and patient journey, shaping the land over thousands of years. Their presence is constant, like an old memory repeating itself quietly. Civilizations will later rise along these rivers, but here, they are still only natural lines on a vast and open canvas. You might notice how lightly people interact with their surroundings, as if they are guests rather than owners of the land. There is no urgency to claim space permanently. Even shelters are rebuilt or reshaped with the seasons. It feels almost as if everything here is practicing how to exist, learning slowly what permanence might mean. Authority is distributed among small groups, often centered around elders or temple figures who interpret seasonal patterns and agricultural needs. Decisions are made through conversation rather than command, and agreement is something that emerges gently over time. If modern life is fast food, this world is a long, quiet meal, prepared without clocks. You may find it slightly amusing to imagine that even disagreements here would take their time, stretching out like long shadows at sunset. Nothing seems to demand immediate resolution, and even tension appears softened by distance and patience. It is a kind of world where waiting is not a burden, but simply part of living. As you continue observing, you become aware of how deeply dependent everything is on the rhythm of water and soil. Farming is not yet industrial or expansive, but intimate and careful. Small plots of land are tended with attention, and survival is tied closely to seasons that arrive without warning or permission. Trade exists, but only in its simplest form, moving between neighboring settlements. Grain, tools, and salt pass quietly from hand to hand, without the sense of expansion or ambition that will later define empires. It feels more like sharing than exchange, as if everyone understands that abundance is temporary and must be respected. There is also a subtle vulnerability in this world, one that is not spoken but always present. Without walls or defined borders, communities remain open to movement from others. Yet this openness does not feel like fear. Instead, it feels like a state of existence that has not yet discovered the concept of protection, only quiet acceptance of flow. You begin to understand that power here is not concentrated, but diffused, resting gently in multiple small centers rather than a single authority. Temples, when present, hold symbolic importance, acting as places where human concerns meet the patterns of nature. Even religion here feels close to the soil, not elevated above it, but softly grounded in daily life. Historically, this world is not without its early marks of structure. Around 9000 BCE, Jericho emerges as one of the earliest known settlements with defensive architecture. Archaeological evidence suggests it once had a stone wall and a surrounding ditch, hinting at one of humanity's first attempts to define protection and separation, long before cities fully existed. As you take in this distant image of Jericho, you realize how quiet its innovation truly is. There is no dramatic announcement, no sudden shift in civilization, only the gradual placement of stones against earth. Even the idea of a wall here feels experimental, like a thought the world is gently testing for the first time. And so you remain in this early chapter of human existence, where everything is still forming, still uncertain, still soft at the edges. Nothing demands attention, and nothing rushes forward. It is a world that has not yet learned how to enclose itself, and perhaps that is why it feels so peaceful, like a breath held just before change begins. You continue walking along the slow riverlands of early civilization, where water moves like a patient memory across the earth. Nothing here feels rushed or sharp. Hello again. Tonight you drift deeper into a world where cities begin to form, but still breathe like living organisms shaped by river, soil, and quiet human presence. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates stretch endlessly through the landscape, creating natural corridors of life. Along their banks, early settlements begin to gather more closely, as if drawn by invisible threads of necessity. You notice how people do not build cities in isolation, but instead allow water to guide where life should gently concentrate and grow. You begin to see small clusters of buildings becoming slightly denser than before. Mud brick homes appear closer, together, forming early patterns that hint at something more structured. Yet, everything still feels soft, as if these settlements are unsure whether they want to become cities or remain as extended villages resting beside flowing water. Authority in this world does not sit in palaces, but in sacred spaces that rise, modestly above the settlements. Temples stand as both spiritual and administrative centers, where offerings and decisions blend into one another. You might even imagine that paperwork here would smell faintly like incense and freshly baked bread, if such a thing could exist. The priestly figures who guide these communities do not appear as rulers in the modern sense, but more like intermediaries between human need and natural rhythm. They interpret seasons, water levels, and harvest cycles, shaping decisions that feel closer to guidance than command. Their influence spreads quietly, like ripples on still water. As you move through this environment, you notice how stability is deeply tied to agriculture. Fields of barley and wheat stretch outward from the riverbanks, forming a living foundation for early urban life. Every harvest becomes a shared moment of survival, and even time itself seems to revolve gently around planting and gathering cycles. There is a strange calm in how everything depends on water, The rivers do not just provide resources, they define existence itself. You might even think of them as silent architects, shaping where people live, how they move, and how their communities slowly take form without urgency or conflict. Small trade routes begin to emerge between nearby settlements. You see goods like grain, dates, and salt moving in simple exchanges. There is no sense of competition in these interactions, only a quiet understanding that survival improves when resources flow gently between communities rather than remaining isolated, each place supporting the other in subtle balance. You pass by a group of traders resting near the riverbank, sharing food and conversation. Their exchange feels almost casual, as if they are not building an economy but simply participating in a shared rhythm of life. The river moves beside them, steady and unhurried, matching the calm pace of their voices and gestures in quiet harmony. Someone jokes that ancient merchants probably never needed alarm clocks because everything moved slowly enough to follow naturally. Time here does not rush or pressure them, but unfolds in a way that feels almost forgiving. Even business feels like conversation, and conversation feels like rest, as if the world itself is teaching them to slow down. As settlements grow denser, social structure begins to take shape. Some individuals gain influence through religious roles, while others manage storage of grain or coordination of labor. You notice how hierarchy here is not imposed suddenly, but emerges gradually, like sediment forming layers over centuries of quiet deposition. Despite this growing organization, there is still a softness to authority. Decisions are often made, collectively within temple spaces, where discussion flows slowly and interruptions are rare. It feels almost like watching a long conversation that never quite ends, only pauses and resumes with the rhythm of daily life. The river continues to be the silent center of everything. Even when people gather for decisions or rituals, the sound of flowing water remains present in the background. It becomes almost symbolic, as if nature itself is quietly participating in governance without ever needing to speak. You begin to notice that settlements near the river are beginning to resemble early cities. Buildings cluster more tightly, pathways become more defined, and storage areas grow larger. Yet there is still no sharp boundary separating one community from another, only gradual transitions across the landscape. This lack of clear borders means that movement remains fluid. People can travel between settlements without encountering strict barriers or defenses. Life flows horizontally rather than being segmented into rigid territories. Even the idea of ownership feels more temporary than permanent in this early stage of civilization. Yet beneath this calm surface, there is a subtle vulnerability. Without unified protection systems, these early cities depend heavily on cooperation and trust. If something were to disrupt this balance, there would be little structural resistance to stop it. But for now, harmony holds the landscape together like soft clay. Historically, one of the most important early urban centers emerges here, Uruk in ancient Sumer, around 4000 BCE. Archaeological findings show it as one of the first true cities, featuring organized districts, monumental architecture, and clear social hierarchy. It represents a turning point where settlement begins to transform into structured civilization. As you imagine Uruk forming slowly along the river, you can almost feel its early architecture rising in silence. Temples grow larger, administrative. Spaces become more defined, and the population increases in density. Yet, even this great early city still breathes in rhythm with the river that made it possible. You realize that authority in this world is not loud or absolute. It is quiet, distributed through systems of water, agriculture, and shared belief. Even power seems to flow rather than stand still, moving like the rivers themselves, shaping life gently and continuously without ever needing to announce its presence or demand attention from those who live within it. It moves like the rivers themselves, shaping life without ever needing to announce its presence. There is no single center that dominates everything. only many small points of balance working together in a slow and steady rhythm. Influence here is something that spreads softly through necessity, cooperation, and the natural alignment of human life with the land and its cycles. And so you remain in this gentle phase of history, where cities are still learning how to exist. Nothing here feels final or fixed. Everything is in motion, slowly forming the foundations of future empires, while the rivers continue their endless, patient journey through the land, carrying time forward without haste or resistance. You continue moving through the slow river civilizations, but now something in the air feels slightly different, as if the horizon itself is beginning to breathe in a new rhythm. Hello, again. Tonight you drift further into a world where movement, beyond the rivers, becomes more noticeable, yet still gentle, like footsteps on dry earth far away. Beyond the fertile river valleys, you begin to notice vast stretches of land where water is scarce and the sky feels wider. In these regions, populations slowly grow as groups adapt to harsher environments. Life here does not settle in one place for long, and survival depends on understanding distance, timing, and seasonal change. You imagine people living in these outer regions moving with quiet patience across deserts and grasslands. Their movement is not sudden or aggressive, but shaped by necessity, following rain, pasture, and the subtle signals of the land. Even their journeys feel like long, soft sentences written across empty pages of earth. In contrast to the river settlements, these groups carry everything with them, creating a different relationship with space. You might even think of them as living like mobile cities, constantly assembling and disassembling their homes as conditions shift. Someone humorously suggests they would have been excellent at modern camping influencers, just without social media. As populations increase in these outer zones, movement naturally becomes more frequent. Seasonal migration patterns form, where groups follow predictable cycles in search of grazing land and water sources. These rhythms slowly connect distant regions, creating invisible pathways across landscapes that once felt empty and untouched. You begin to sense how the river cities and outer groups are no longer completely separate worlds. Trade, exchange, and occasional contact begin to occur at the edges. Not conflict, but interaction shaped by shared needs. Grain from the rivers meets livestock from the dry lands in quiet exchanges that neither side fully defines. The river cities continue their steady growth, but now there is a subtle pressure building around them. More people require more resources, and fertile land becomes increasingly valuable. You notice that agricultural expansion begins to stretch outward, slowly approaching regions that were once considered distant or secondary. Yet nothing here happens abruptly. The pressure is not like a storm, but a gradual shift in balance. Fields are extended, irrigation channels expand, and settlements slowly grow closer together. Everything remains calm on the surface, while underneath, the system quietly adjusts itself to new demands and changing patterns of survival. In the outer regions, new centers of influence begin to appear. These are not cities in the river sense, but gathering points shaped by movement, trade routes, and seasonal convergence. Life organizes itself around motion, not permanence, as people follow familiar cycles across wide and open landscapes without fixed boundaries. You can imagine them as soft knots in a vast network of travel, where people pause before continuing their long journeys. These places are temporary yet meaningful, offering rest, exchange, and orientation. They exist not as destinations, but as gentle intersections in the continuous flow of human movement across time and space. These emerging centers do not challenge the river cities directly, but they introduce a new kind of spatial awareness. Suddenly, the world feels larger and more interconnected. Distance is no longer empty space, but a medium through which relationships slowly form and dissolve over time. You walk through this expanded landscape and realize that the idea of inside and outside is beginning to shift. The river valleys are no longer isolated centers of life, but part of a broader system of movement. Even silence in the desert now feels like part of the same larger conversation. Despite this growing complexity, there is still no sense of invasion or confrontation. Instead, there is gradual convergence, where different ways of life begin to overlap naturally. People adjust to each other's presence without defining strict boundaries, as if civilization itself is still experimenting with how separation should work. In this process, resources become more sensitive. Water sources, grazing land, and fertile soil begin to hold greater importance. Yet even here, scarcity does not immediately lead to conflict. Instead, it leads to negotiation, adaptation, and subtle shifts in where people choose to settle or move. You notice that some groups begin to develop stronger leadership structures as movement increases. Coordination becomes more important for survival, and decisions require faster agreement than before. Still, these changes happen quietly, without grand declarations or sudden transformations in authority. The river civilizations observe these changes from a distance, slowly adapting their own systems of storage, trade, and expansion. Yet they remain anchored by the stability of water and agriculture. It is as if they are watching the edges of their world slowly reshape themselves without fully changing their center. Historically, this period reflects movements such as those of the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who gradually migrated into Mesopotamia over many generations. They did not arrive as a single force, but in repeated waves of settlement, trade, and seasonal movement, slowly becoming part of the river-based societies that already existed. Over time, they integrated into local communities and eventually contributed to the formation of Babylonian civilization. This process unfolded gradually through intermarriage, cultural exchange, and shared administration, showing how movement and settlement in the ancient world often blended into continuity rather than violent collision or sudden replacement. As you imagine the Amorites moving across landscapes, you see no clear moment of arrival, only gradual presence. They do not appear as outsiders in a dramatic sense, but as participants in a long process of integration. Over generations, distinction fades, and new cultural layers quietly form. This blending of peoples reveals a deeper pattern in early human history. Movement is not interruption, but continuity. Populations shift, adapt, and merge, creating civilizations that are never fully fixed. Even identity here feels fluid, shaped by time rather than rigid definition, as if people are always becoming something slightly different without ever fully noticing it. And so you remain in this expanding world, where pressure does not break systems, but slowly reshapes them. Everything is still calm, still balanced, but no longer static. Change arrives quietly, through repeated contact, shared need, and gradual adjustment, rather than sudden disruption or visible collapse that would demand attention or immediate response from anyone. The edges of civilization are moving gently, like tides that do not yet realize they are becoming oceans. Nothing announces this transformation, yet everything participates in it. What once felt like separate lands now begins to blur into wider patterns of connection, where distance softens and boundaries lose their sharpness in the slow rhythm of time. You continue drifting through the slow evolution of early civilization, where the landscape begins to feel less like open earth and more like a carefully shaped stage for human settlement. Hello again. Tonight you step into a moment where stillness starts to transform into structure, and the idea of protection quietly begins to take form. You notice that the river systems now act as invisible highways connecting distant communities. Trade routes naturally follow the flow of water, and settlements begin to emerge at intersections where movement is easiest. These locations feel like gentle pauses in a long journey, where people gather, exchange, and then continue onward. The land itself plays a quiet role in this transformation. Wide open plains stretch between settlements, offering no natural barriers to movement. This openness allows interaction to flourish, but it also means that every place remains easily reachable from multiple directions, creating a subtle sense of exposure that no one openly acknowledges. As you walk further, you begin to understand why certain locations become more important than others. It is not only about beauty or comfort, but about convergence. Where rivers meet, where paths cross, where resources overlap, these places slowly attract more people, like soft gravitational centers forming in an expanding world. Agriculture continues to deepen its influence on settlement patterns. Fields become more productive, and harvests begin to produce surpluses beyond immediate survival needs. This abundance changes everything in a quiet way, because now, not every grain is needed right away, and storage begins to matter as much as production itself. You observe how these surplus resources gradually concentrate in central locations. Grain is collected, stored, and managed in larger quantities than before. Storage areas become more organized, and with them, the idea of accumulation slowly emerges. It is a subtle shift, almost invisible but fundamentally transformative for human society. At the heart of many settlements, temples and administrative spaces begin to hold these growing reserves. These structures are not just spiritual centers anymore, but also practical ones. They manage distribution, organize labor, and oversee the careful balance between supply and demand, all in a calm and deliberate rhythm. You might find it amusing that in this ancient world, the earliest version of warehouse management is deeply connected to sacred spaces. What would later become bureaucratic systems still feels spiritual here, as if accounting itself has not yet decided whether it belongs to heaven or earth. As storage becomes more important, so does the question of protection. Not in an aggressive sense, but in a practical one. If resources are gathered in one place, then that place naturally becomes more significant, and anything significant tends to require care, attention, and eventually, boundaries. You begin to sense the early formation of what might be called spatial awareness. People start to understand that not all space is equal. Some areas contain food, tools, and communal wealth, while others remain open and less structured. This difference slowly encourages the idea that certain spaces should be defined more clearly. Even though there is still no concept of modern borders, a mental shift is occurring. Communities begin to distinguish between inside and outside, not as political terms, but as practical observations. Inside is where resources are stored, and outside is where uncertainty moves freely across the land. This distinction becomes more meaningful as populations grow. More people mean more demand, and more demand means more reliance on organized storage. The center of each settlement becomes increasingly important, not just symbolically, but functionally, as the place where survival is carefully maintained. You notice how movement within these settlements begins to subtly reorganize itself. Paths become more defined, and access to storage areas becomes more structured. Even without formal architecture, human behavior begins to trace invisible lines that will later become physical boundaries. At this stage, the idea of a wall is not yet fully formed. Instead, there is a gradual awareness that some things should remain closer together, while others should remain at a distance. This awareness grows slowly, like a thought forming at the edge of consciousness but not yet spoken aloud. The environment itself encourages this shift. Open plains offer no protection from wind, weather, or movement from surrounding regions. As settlements grow more valuable, the need for some form of separation becomes increasingly logical, even if it has not yet been fully conceptualized. You begin to imagine how conversations might sound in this period. Perhaps someone casually mentions that storing grain in one central place feels slightly vulnerable. Another person might agree, not out of fear, but out of quiet observation. These small discussions gradually shape the earliest foundations of defensive thinking. Historically, this moment is reflected in early Sumerian cities such as Ur and Uruk, where communities begin constructing defensive walls using sun-dried mud brick. These structures are built gradually, layer by layer, responding to growing settlement size and increasing need to protect central areas where resources, people, and administration begin to concentrate within expanding urban life. These early walls are not massive military fortifications in the later historical sense, but practical boundaries shaped by necessity. They enclose storage spaces, temples, and key communal areas, helping organize growing populations and safeguard essential resources. Over time, they become one of the first architectural expressions of how human societies begin defining space through physical limits. As you picture these early walls rising, you realize they are not built in response to war alone, but also in response to organization. They help structure growing settlements, guiding how people live together and manage shared resources in a more deliberate and coordinated way across expanding urban spaces. They define what belongs within a community's care and what lies beyond it. In this way, walls are not only barriers but also statements of identity. They quietly express belonging, separating shared responsibility from the surrounding unknown, while shaping how early societies understand space, protection, and collective human presence over time. There is something quietly poetic about this development. What begins as simple protection gradually becomes architecture, and what begins as necessity slowly becomes symbol. The act of enclosing space marks a turning point where human settlements begin to define themselves not only by presence, but by separation, and so you remain in this calm moment of transformation, where walls are not yet symbols of conflict, but gentle lines drawn across the landscape of survival. Everything is still slow, still quiet, but now the world has begun to understand the meaning of inside and outside, and nothing will remain entirely open for long. You continue moving through the quiet evolution of early city life, where boundaries now exist, but they are still soft, still negotiable, still shaped by human presence rather than force. Hello, again. Tonight you drift into a world where expansion does not arrive loudly, but slowly, like shadows lengthening across an already familiar landscape. The rivers remain the main arteries of life, but now they carry more than water and grain. Along their banks, you notice an increasing presence of travelers, merchants, and small groups moving between settlements. They do not arrive as conquerors or strangers, but as participants in an expanding web of exchange. These merchants bring with them goods that feel slightly unfamiliar to local communities. New tools, different pottery styles, and rare materials begin to circulate. Nothing here feels disruptive, yet each exchange subtly expands the reach of distant regions into the daily life of river settlements. You observe how interaction begins to reshape relationships between communities. Instead of isolated villages or cities, there is now a growing network of contact points. These connections are not formal or rigid, but fluid, maintained through repeated visits, shared needs, and mutual convenience rather than written agreements. As movement increases, so does the importance of trust. In a world without strong centralized control, relationships become the foundation of stability. You begin to see how alliances form not through force, but through repeated exchanges that slowly build familiarity over time. Marriage between influential families becomes one of these quiet mechanisms of connection. It is not political in the modern sense, but practical, linking communities through kinship. These unions create bonds that extend beyond geography, weaving settlements together in ways that feel both personal and structural. Gift exchange also plays a subtle but important role. Leaders and temples exchange symbolic items that reinforce goodwill and shared recognition. These gestures are not grand or dramatic, but they carry meaning that accumulates slowly, like sediment building up over years of gentle deposition. At the same time, you begin to notice changes in resource distribution. As populations grow and networks expand, certain areas experience increased pressure on water and farmland. Irrigation systems stretch further, and fields are used more intensively, creating a quiet tension between abundance and demand. This tension does not immediately lead to conflict, but it quietly reshapes priorities. Communities begin to pay closer attention to how resources are managed, especially in relation to water and land. Irrigation channels are maintained with greater care, and agricultural planning becomes more deliberate, reflecting a growing awareness of balance between abundance and limitation. Even the rhythm of planting and harvesting begins to reflect these new constraints. Seasons are no longer only natural cycles, but carefully observed schedules that influence survival and stability. People adjust their routines in subtle ways, aligning daily life more closely with environmental conditions and shared responsibilities. Across the community, you walk through settlements where life still feels peaceful, yet slightly more structured than before. Storage areas are larger, administrative roles more defined, and movement within the city more organized. Everything remains calm on the surface, but beneath it, coordination is becoming increasingly important for maintaining order and long-term sustainability. Along the outer edges of these growing settlements, something subtle begins to shift. Peripheral areas, once loosely connected, start to fall under more consistent influence from central authorities. This is not sudden control, but gradual integration, as responsibilities slowly extend outward. You might think of it as a soft gradient, rather than a hard boundary. Influence fades gradually from center to edge, and over time, even distant areas begin to follow the rhythms of central organization. It is control without declaration, expansion without visible conquest. The idea of encirclement here is not physical in the military sense, but relational. Networks of trade, kinship, and resource management slowly wrap around communities, connecting them more tightly to central hubs through repeated interaction, shared needs, and gradually expanding systems of cooperation that grow stronger over time. It feels less like being surrounded and more like being gently woven into a larger fabric. Each connection adds another thread of dependence and exchange, forming a quiet structure that holds communities together without force, shaping identity and belonging through continuity, familiarity, and the steady rhythm of everyday interaction. Even with these changes, there is no single moment where everything shifts. Instead, transformation happens in increments so small they are almost invisible. One agreement leads to another, one exchange becomes routine, and gradually independence becomes interdependence without any clear breaking point. You begin, too, realize that power in this world is not imposed from above, but accumulated through connection. The more a settlement participates in shared systems, the more it becomes part of a wider structure. Yet this participation still feels voluntary, even when it becomes necessary for survival. In some regions, external groups begin to establish more consistent presence. They do not arrive with armies, but with relationships, trade, and gradual integration. Over time, these connections reshape local autonomy, bringing distant areas closer to centralized influence without abrupt disruption. Historically, this pattern is reflected in the rise of Akkad under Sargon, who established one of the earliest known empires in Mesopotamia. Instead of relying only on direct military conquest, his rule combined political authority with structured administration, allowing multiple independent Sumerian cities to gradually come under a shared system of governance and centralized leadership. Across the region, Sargon's expansion of influence was strengthened through taxation, record-keeping, and organized bureaucracy, which connected distant cities into a single coordinated framework. This system enabled resources, labor, and information to move more efficiently across territories, creating stability beyond battlefield control. His approach marked a shift from isolated city-states toward an integrated imperial structure in early history. As you imagine Akkad's influence spreading, you see it not as a wave crashing over land, but as a slowly expanding network of order. Cities remain in place, but their decisions increasingly align with a broader system. Control becomes less visible, but more present in daily life. This form of expansion feels almost natural in its progression. It does not erase existing structures immediately, but gradually aligns them with new patterns. Over time, autonomy becomes layered with administration, and independence blends with integration in ways that are difficult to separate. And so you remain in this quiet phase of encirclement, where expansion is not marked by borders or battles, but by relationships that deepen over time. Everything continues to move slowly, gently, and almost imperceptibly, like a tide that rises without sound, reshaping the shoreline without ever announcing its arrival. You continue walking through the long river civilizations, where time no longer feels like a sequence of events, but more like a slow rearrangement of presence. Hello, again. Tonight you step into a moment where power changes hands, yet nothing dramatic announces itself, only a gradual shift in how the world organizes itself. The old centers of authority, once steady and unquestioned, begin to feel slightly less dominant. You notice it not through collapse, but through absence. Decisions take longer, coordination feels less certain, and communication between regions becomes more delayed, as if the system that once held everything together is slowly stretching across greater distances. The familiar rhythm of leadership begins to lose its earlier clarity, like a voice growing softer across a widening space. Orders are still given, but they arrive with less immediacy and consistency. What once felt direct and stable now feels more distant, as layers of administration and geography gradually reshape the flow of authority. There is no sudden disappearance of structure. Instead, systems that once felt unified begin to feel distributed. Local leaders still act, temples still function, and trade continues, but the sense of central cohesion slowly weakens, as if the threads holding everything together are loosening, without breaking. In the same landscape, you begin to sense the emergence of a new center of influence. It does not appear all at once, nor does it announce itself. It forms gradually through networks of control, administration, and communication that extend further than earlier systems ever managed to reach. This new center is not defined only by geography, but by organization. It connects cities through shared systems of taxation, record-keeping, and governance. You realize that power here is no longer just about place, but about coordination across distance, held together by increasingly structured administration. As you move through this shifting world, you notice how familiar cities still continue their daily routines. Farmers still tend fields, merchants still travel along river routes, and temple workers still maintain rituals with steady care. Life does not pause for political transformation or administrative change. Instead, it quietly adapts around it, continuing its familiar rhythm beneath evolving structures of authority. There is something quietly humbling in this continuity. Even as authority shifts, the rhythm of human life remains steady. You might imagine someone pausing briefly during a transaction, noticing that the name of the ruling authority has changed, and then continuing their work without further concern. The transition of power does not arrive as a singular moment. There is no clear day when one system ends and another begins. Instead, the change spreads across years, sometimes generations, until people eventually realize that the structure around them has become something different from what it once was. You begin to understand that historical change in this world is not event-based, but process-based. It is not defined by endings or beginnings, but by continuous adjustment. Even those living through it may not recognize the transition until it is already well underway. Administrative practices gradually replace older forms of local governance. Record-keeping becomes more standardized, communication more regulated, and obligations more clearly defined. Yet all of this happens within the same physical spaces, using familiar buildings and familiar people. You walk through a city where scribes now play an increasingly important role. Clay tablets are used to record transactions, agreements, and taxes. The act of writing becomes a quiet form of power, shaping how information flows through society without requiring visible force. Even with these changes, daily life remains grounded in continuity. People still rely on rivers, fields, and seasonal cycles. The administrative layer exists above these rhythms, but does not replace them. It gently overlays structure onto a world that continues to function in older, more organic ways. In this period of transformation, you begin to notice how governance becomes less personal and more systemic. Authority is no longer tied to individual leaders alone, but to institutions that continue operating beyond any single figure or moment in time. This shift makes power feel both more stable and more distant at the same time. Decisions carry the weight of structure rather than personality, creating a sense of continuity that persists even as the people within the system change gradually over generations. The sense of distance is subtle but noticeable. Decisions now travel through layers of administration before reaching local communities. This does not disrupt life immediately, but it changes how people experience authority, which now feels less like presence and more like process. As you continue observing, you realize that even resistance to change is minimal, not because it is absent, but because transformation happens slowly enough that adaptation becomes the default response. People adjust rather than react, and continuity absorbs disruption almost effortlessly. Historically, this transformation is closely associated with the rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE. Sargon emerged from the region of Kish and gradually consolidated power across Mesopotamia, bringing previously independent Sumerian city-states under his authority through a combination of military strength, diplomacy, and strategic alliances that reshaped regional political structure. It is widely regarded as the first known empire in history, uniting multiple Sumerian city-states under a centralized system of administration and control. This included appointing governors, standardizing tribute, and establishing communication networks across vast distances. The Akkadian system allowed resources and authority to flow from a central capital, creating a unified political structure over diverse territories. You imagine this unification not as a sudden conquest, but as a gradual layering of systems. Cities remain in place, but their autonomy becomes increasingly integrated into a broader framework. The empire exists not by replacing cities, but by connecting them through structured governance. Sargon's system introduces a new scale of organization. Messages, resources, and authority begin to flow across wider distances than before. This creates a sense of cohesion across regions that were once loosely connected, transforming scattered cities into parts of a larger administrative whole. Yet even within this expanded structure, life at the local level continues with remarkable normalcy. Farmers still harvest, traders still exchange goods, and families still gather in familiar ways. The empire exists above these routines, shaping them quietly rather than disrupting them completely. And so you remain in this calm moment of transition, where change is present but not disruptive, where power shifts but life continues, and where history moves forward without announcing its arrival. Everything feels steady, as if the world is gently rewriting itself while refusing to disturb the people who live within it. You continue walking through the evolving river civilizations, where boundaries now exist not as sudden lines, but as living structures that people have quietly learned to move within. Hello again. Tonight you step into a world where change has already happened, and what remains is the gentle process of adaptation. The cities feel familiar, yet subtly reorganized. Walls stand where open space once existed, and administrative centers now influence daily routines in ways that are not always immediately visible. You notice how people move through these spaces with a kind of practiced ease, as if they have always lived within such structures. Language continues to shift, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. You might hear different dialects blending together, in marketplaces where communication adapts to necessity rather than formal design. Words change shape over generations, yet meaning remains surprisingly stable, carried forward like water through changing channels. Writing systems also persist through this transformation. Scribal traditions remain essential for administration and trade, even as political authority changes above them. You begin to understand how deeply embedded these systems are, functioning as continuity beneath layers of shifting governance. Merchants move through these new boundaries with remarkable consistency. Their routes remain largely unchanged, following established paths along rivers and trade corridors. Goods still flow between regions, and commerce continues to operate as it always has, guided more by necessity than by political restructuring. There is something quietly reassuring about this continuity. Even as empires expand and administrative systems evolve, the practical rhythms of trade remain steady. You might imagine a merchant pausing briefly at a checkpoint, adjusting to a new seal or record system, then continuing the journey without hesitation. Taxation becomes more structured under the new order, yet its implementation feels gradual rather than disruptive. People adapt to these systems over time, incorporating them into existing routines. What might have once felt external slowly becomes familiar, eventually turning into an expected part of daily life, woven quietly into the fabric of routine existence. Despite these changes, there is little sense of abrupt disruption among ordinary people. Life continues with a familiar rhythm, shaped by agriculture, trade, and seasonal cycles. The new structures exist above these patterns, but do not replace them entirely, allowing continuity to persist beneath administrative change and supporting long-standing ways of living. You notice how older cultural practices remain present, even as they are gradually integrated into broader systems. Rituals continue, festivals are observed, and local traditions endure with steady consistency. These elements are not removed but carried forward, adapting gently as they pass through expanding layers of governance and organization. Instead of being erased, they are absorbed, reshaped gently by the expanding structure of governance. Cultural life becomes layered rather than replaced, preserving memory within new frameworks. Over time, this blending creates a quiet continuity, where the past remains visible within the present, even as systems of authority continue to evolve. This blending creates a layered cultural landscape. Older identities do not disappear, but coexist with newer administrative realities. You begin to see how civilizations here are not replaced, but accumulated, each layer adding structure without fully removing what came before. There is a quiet resilience in this process. People adjust without losing their connection to familiar ways of life. Even when official systems change, personal and communal practices maintain continuity, preserving a sense of stability within broader transformation. Life continues with steady rhythm, as if change itself is simply another layer added onto what already exists. You might find it interesting how identity in this world is not fixed, but adaptive. Communities continue to define themselves through local customs while simultaneously participating in larger political and economic systems. These overlapping identities coexist without apparent conflict, allowing individuals to move between different layers of belonging without needing to abandon older cultural foundations. In marketplaces, this blending becomes especially visible. Different languages, goods, and customs intersect naturally, creating environments where diversity is not exceptional but expected. Interaction becomes a daily negotiation between continuity and adaptation, as traders and buyers navigate shared spaces shaped by many traditions existing side by side in practical harmony. Even administrative changes are absorbed into routine life with surprising ease. New systems of record-keeping or taxation become part of regular interactions, gradually losing their novelty. Over time, what once felt new becomes simply how things are done, woven quietly into the background of everyday life without disrupting its familiar flow. Historically, one of the most remarkable continuities of this era is the use of cuneiform writing, developed in ancient Mesopotamia. This script originated among the Sumerians and was impressed into clay tablets using a reed stylus. Over time, it evolved in form and usage, becoming a foundational system for recording trade, laws, and administrative decisions across vast regions. Cuneiform persisted across multiple empires, including Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian periods, serving as a stable administrative tool despite constant political transformation. Scribes were trained for years to master it, ensuring continuity in governance, taxation, and communication. Even as rulers and capitals changed, this writing system remained a unifying instrument of record-keeping and bureaucratic memory. You imagine scribes carefully pressing symbols into clay tablets, maintaining consistency across generations. Their hands repeat the same learned movements, shaping records that will outlast individual lives. Even as rulers change, the script remains familiar, allowing continuity of communication and record-keeping across shifting administrations and long spans of time. It becomes a silent bridge between shifting systems of authority. Across different cities and empires, the same written forms carry messages, transactions, and decisions. This shared language of administration allows complex societies to function without interruption, even when political power moves from one center to another over many generations. This persistence reveals something important about adaptation. Change in this world does not always mean replacement or erasure. Instead, it often unfolds as gradual layering, where new structures are added on top of older ones, preserving useful elements while slowly reshaping how they are used in daily governance and organization. New systems frequently adopt and preserve older methods rather than discarding them entirely. Writing, record-keeping, and administrative practices evolve slowly, allowing continuity to remain visible even as societies grow more complex. What appears as change is often integration, where past and present coexist within the same functional framework. And so you remain in this calm period of adjustment, where boundaries exist but do not divide sharply. Systems evolve without erasing what came before, and human life continues to flow steadily through layers of history that accumulate rather than collapse, forming a quiet continuity across generations and changing civilizations. You continue your quiet passage through the unfolding layers of early civilization, where the world now feels more structured, more deliberate, yet still carried by the same slow river rhythms that shaped everything before. Hello again. Tonight, you step into a phase where order returns, not as chaos resolved, but as systems refined. The landscape of cities feels more organized than before. Administrative centers now stand with clearer purpose, and their influence reaches farther into surrounding regions. You notice how daily life is increasingly shaped by schedules, obligations, and standardized expectations that quietly guide how communities function within the larger system, creating a more structured rhythm of urban existence. Taxation becomes more consistent across regions. Instead of varied local practices, there is now a more unified approach to collecting resources. Officials follow shared procedures, reducing uncertainty in how obligations are defined and fulfilled. This consistency helps connect distant cities through common administrative expectations, slowly strengthening the sense of an interconnected political and economic framework. This change does not arrive suddenly, but rather settles into place, gradually, like sediment forming a steady layer over time. Each adjustment builds upon the last, creating predictability where variation once existed. Over generations, what once felt fragmented becomes structured, as governance, economy, and daily life align more closely under evolving systems of coordination and control. You begin to see how standardization brings a new kind of stability. People understand what is expected of them more clearly, and uncertainty in administrative matters begins to fade. Even though obligations may increase, the clarity of structure gives a sense of order that many quietly adapt to. Within this framework, written law begins to emerge as a defining feature of governance. Rules are no longer only passed through oral tradition or local authority, but recorded in permanent form on clay and stone. This shift introduces a sense of fixed reference, something stable that can be preserved and consulted across many generations. Of society. You might imagine scribes carefully carving symbols into stone or pressing them into clay, not with urgency, but with deliberate attention. Their movements are slow and precise, shaped by training and repetition. Each mark is intentional, reflecting a system where knowledge is preserved through physical record rather than spoken memory or personal interpretation alone. Each inscription carries weight, not just as instruction, but as permanence. Law becomes something visible in the physical world, anchored in material form rather than memory alone. In this way, governance gains a lasting presence, allowing rules to exist beyond individual voices, ensuring continuity even as rulers, cities, and generations gradually change over time. Historically, this period is marked by the creation of the Code of Hammurabi around 1754 BCE under King Hammurabi of Babylon. It emerged during a time of consolidation in Mesopotamia, when political authority sought greater consistency across expanding territories. The code was publicly displayed, ensuring that laws were visible, standardized, and accessible throughout the Babylonian Empire. It is one of the earliest known written legal systems, inscribed on a tall stone stele featuring hundreds of legal provisions covering trade, property, family relations, and justice. The code established rules and consequences in a unified framework, representing a major step toward centralized legal authority, where law was no longer local custom but recorded state regulation. You continue walking through this structured world where law now exists above daily life, shaping behavior in ways that are both visible and subtle. The presence of written rules introduces consistency, reducing ambiguity in disputes and reinforcing a shared understanding of order across different communities. Alongside legal development, military structures begin to take on a more defined and lasting role within society. Armies are no longer temporary forces gathered only for specific conflicts, but organized institutions with established hierarchies and responsibilities. They help maintain stability across regions, enforce authority, and support administrative systems, becoming an integrated part of the broader framework of governance and imperial control over time. You observe how soldiers are not only associated with warfare, but also with enforcement of order within the empire. Their role extends into ensuring compliance with administrative systems, protecting trade routes, and supporting the authority of centralized leadership across distant cities. Despite this increased structure, life in cities continues with familiar rhythms. Farmers still cultivate fields, merchants still exchange goods, and families still gather in daily routines. The empire exists not above life, but within it, shaping patterns without replacing the fundamental flow of human activity. Cities, now, become more clearly defined as administrative centers. They are not only places of habitation, but nodes of governance, where records are kept, decisions are made, and authority is exercised. Their importance grows not just through population, but through function within the imperial system. You notice how these cities begin to reflect their administrative role in their physical layout. Roads become more organized. Storage facilities expand, and official buildings occupy central positions. The structure of the city begins to mirror the structure of the system that governs it. Walls around these cities take on a new meaning. What once served primarily as protection now also represents authority and identity. They define the limits of administrative space, symbolizing the presence of organized power and the boundaries of controlled regions within the broader landscape. These walls are not merely defensive structures, but statements of permanence. They suggest stability, continuity, and control, reinforcing the idea that the city is not temporary, but enduring over time. Even from a distance, they communicate presence and structure to anyone approaching, shaping how travelers perceive authority before they even enter the city itself. You begin to sense how governance now operates through multiple layers. Legal systems, administrative procedures, military oversight, and urban organization all work together to create a cohesive structure. Each layer supports the others, forming a network of control that extends across the empire, ensuring order across regions that are geographically distant yet administratively connected. Yet, even within this structure, there is continuity with earlier life. Agricultural cycles still determine much of daily activity, and natural rhythms remain central to survival. The empire does not replace these cycles, but organizes them within a larger framework of regulation and coordination, allowing ancient patterns of life to persist beneath new systems. And so you remain in this period of restored order, where systems feel more defined, yet still deeply connected to the older rhythms of river, land, and human necessity. Everything appears more stable now, as if civilization has paused briefly to refine its structure before continuing its long and quiet expansion. You continue your slow journey through the layered world of ancient empires, where nothing ever fully disappears, but everything gradually becomes part of something larger. Hello, again. Tonight you enter a stage where integration is no longer a process in progress but a condition quietly settled into the land itself. The empire now feels more geographically defined than before. Administrative boundaries appear across regions, not as sudden divisions, but as carefully maintained zones of responsibility. These lines are not always visible on the ground, yet they shape how cities relate to one another across distance. Utendi. Notice how officials and scribes now reference regions with increasing consistency. What once was a collection of loosely connected cities is now organized into recognizable administrative units. These divisions help manage resources, communication, and authority in a way that feels more structured and predictable. Despite this growing organization, movement across the empire remains fluid. Roads and river routes continue to carry traders, travelers, and messengers between cities. The system does not restrict flow completely, but rather channels it, like water guided, gently through carefully maintained pathways. Trade begins to expand on a larger scale than before. Goods now travel across greater distances, connecting regions that were once only indirectly linked. You can imagine caravans moving slowly under the sun, carrying materials that will pass through many hands before reaching their final destination. This expansion of commerce creates a quiet sense of interdependence. Cities no longer function as isolated centers, but as parts of a broader economic network. Each region contributes something unique, and each relies on others in ways that are not always immediately visible. You begin to observe how local cultures persist even within this expanding structure. Traditions, rituals, and artistic expressions continue to exist, but they now interact more frequently with influences from other regions. The result is not replacement, but gradual blending over time. This blending creates a cultural landscape that feels layered rather than uniform. Local identities remain recognizable, yet they are increasingly shaped by interaction with the wider imperial system. You might think of it as multiple currents flowing through the same river without losing their individual motion. In cities, architecture begins to reflect these subtle transformations. New structures appear alongside older buildings, creating a visual record of change over time. Yet this transformation is slow, almost unnoticeable from day to day, as if the city is quietly rewriting itself without interruption. You walk through streets where older materials still form the foundation of daily life. Mud brick structures remain common, but they are now joined by more complex administrative buildings. The city feels like a living archive, where each layer of construction preserves a moment in its long evolution. Walls around cities begin to take on a more symbolic presence. While they still serve practical defensive purposes, they also represent continuity and identity. They stand as reminders of stability, even as societies within them continue to evolve, expand, and integrate into larger imperial structures that reshape political and cultural organization over time. Over time, these Walls become part of the cultural memory of the city. They are no longer just functional barriers, but historical markers that define the endurance of urban life. Their presence communicates both protection and legacy, linking present communities to their past while preserving the memory of generations who once lived and built within the same enduring spaces. You notice how integration does not erase local character. Instead, it reshapes how that character exists within a broader framework. Customs adapt, languages shift slightly, and administrative practices become more standardized. Yet the essence of local life continues to persist beneath these changes, maintaining continuity across generations and evolving systems of organization. This gradual adaptation allows communities to remain recognizable while participating in larger imperial systems. Daily life reflects both tradition and adjustment, as people navigate between inherited customs and new administrative expectations. Nothing is fully replaced. Instead, older patterns are reorganized, creating a layered society where continuity and change coexist in quiet balance. This balance between unity and diversity defines the empire at this stage. It is neither fully uniform nor fragmented, but something in between. A complex system where differences are maintained, yet coordinated under shared structures of governance and exchange, allowing vast territories to function together while preserving local identity and cultural variation. Historically, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar's Setu represents one of the most iconic expressions of integrated imperial identity in the ancient Near East. During his reign in the 6th century BCE, the city reached a remarkable level of urban and political development, becoming a central hub of administration, religion, and culture within the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The city was renowned for its massive double walls and the famous Ishtar Gate, both constructed with extraordinary scale and craftsmanship. These monumental structures symbolized not only architectural power, but also imperial authority and cultural sophistication. Together, they reflected a civilization that unified engineering, artistic expression, and governance into a single, enduring representation of Babylonian greatness. You imagine the Ishtar Gate, rising in brilliant blue-glazed bricks, decorated with intricate reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons that reflect both artistic achievement and imperial authority. It is not only a monumental entrance, but also a statement of identity, blending religion, politics, and urban design into a unified expression of Babylonian civilization and cultural power. As you move through this imagined Babylon, you feel how integration has become visible in stone, color, and spatial design. The city is not just functional, but deeply expressive, reflecting accumulated influence from many surrounding regions brought together under a single imperial framework that organizes diversity without fully erasing its original cultural sources. Temples, palaces, and administrative buildings stand in close relation, forming a carefully structured urban environment. Each space serves both practical and symbolic purposes, reinforcing the connection between governance and belief. The city itself becomes a living composition, where architecture communicates authority, stability, and shared identity across different layers of society and historical development. Yet, even in this grandeur, the underlying rhythm of life remains steady and familiar. People continue their daily routines, markets continue to operate with steady exchange, and the river continues to flow beside the city as it has for generations. Integration changes structure, but it does not interrupt the fundamental continuity of human existence. And so you remain in this quiet phase of synthesis, where borders are defined yet porous, and cultures merge without dissolving into uniformity. The empire exists not as a single voice, but as a layered harmony of many enduring histories, each contributing its own tone to the slow and continuous rhythm of civilization over time. You continue your slow passage through the long memory of empires, where nothing truly ends and nothing remains perfectly still. Hello again. Tonight you arrive at a moment where the system feels vast and stable, yet subtle movements at the edges begin to suggest that even great structures are always in motion. The heart of the empire still functions with clarity and order. Cities remain active, trade continues, and administration holds everything together in a carefully maintained balance. Yet, far from the center, in distant regions, small changes begin to appear like faint ripples on a very wide surface of water. You move toward the outer territories, where control is thinner and communication takes longer. Here, the presence of central authority is less immediate. Local conditions begin to shape daily life more strongly, and small inconsistencies emerge in how the imperial system is applied across distance. These peripheral regions are not collapsing, but they are shifting. You notice that decisions take longer to implement, and coordination becomes more complex. The structure remains intact, yet its responsiveness feels slightly slower, as if the empire is stretching across too much space at once, testing the limits of connection. In these distant areas, local tensions begin to rise gently, not as dramatic conflict but as subtle divergence in interests and priorities. Daily life continues, yet priorities slowly differ from the center. People adapt to immediate surroundings, making small adjustments that reflect distance, geography, and the gradual weakening of centralized rhythm. Communities begin to respond more to local conditions than to central directives, creating a quiet drift in alignment across the wider system. Authority is still acknowledged but less directly felt. Over time, this soft divergence shapes a landscape where unity remains present, yet increasingly dependent on fragile threads of coordination. You observe how geography plays an increasing role in shaping stability. Mountain passes, desert routes, and frontier settlements all introduce friction into communication and control. The further you move from the center, the more the empire feels like a memory rather than a constant presence. Beyond the borders of the empire, new groups begin to form and reorganize themselves. These are not sudden appearances but gradual consolidations of communities adapting to their own environments. They exist outside the imperial system, yet remain indirectly connected through trade and movement. You begin to sense how the edges of civilizations are never truly empty. Even when not under direct control, surrounding regions develop their own structures, leadership patterns, and networks of interaction. These emerging systems exist in parallel, shaping a wider world beyond the empire's immediate reach. At times, movement from these external groups becomes more noticeable. Seasonal migrations, trade interactions, and shifting environmental conditions bring them closer to imperial borders. These encounters are not always confrontational, but they do introduce new pressures into already complex frontier regions. You notice how these interactions require constant adaptation from both sides. The empire must adjust its administrative reach, while external groups respond to changing opportunities and constraints. It is not a single moment of contact, but an ongoing negotiation across space and time. As you walk through this evolving landscape, you realize that expansion itself begins to change character. What once felt like growth now begins to feel like maintenance. The larger the system becomes, the more effort is required simply to hold it together in its existing form. Resources that once fueled expansion are now increasingly used for administration and control. Communication, logistics, and enforcement require sustained attention. The energy of growth gradually shifts toward the effort of sustaining what has already been established across vast distances. You begin to understand that scale brings its own kind of vulnerability. A system stretched across many regions becomes more complex to manage, and small disruptions at the edges can take longer to resolve. Stability is still present, but it requires constant maintenance to preserve. In the outer territories, you notice subtle signs of independence re-emerging. Local leaders gain more influence, and regional priorities begin to diverge slightly from central expectations. These changes are not dramatic, but they slowly accumulate over time, shaping the character of frontier life. The empire does not ignore these shifts, but responds through adjustment rather than immediate force. Administrative reforms, localized. Agreements and strategic oversight are used to maintain cohesion. The system adapts continuously, reflecting the changing realities of its own scale. You begin to see how power at this stage is no longer just expansion, but balance. It is the management of distance, difference, and diversity across a vast landscape. The empire exists not as a single point of control, but as a distributed network of influence. Historically, this pattern becomes especially visible in the later rise of the Assyrian Empire, which developed one of the most advanced systems of territorial control in the ancient world. Emerging from northern Mesopotamia, it gradually expanded through a combination of military campaigns, strategic governance, and tightly organized administrative structures that linked distant provinces into a unified imperial framework. Its administrative and military organization allowed it to manage vast regions across Mesopotamia and beyond, with remarkable efficiency for its time. The empire relied on governors, standardized communication routes, and a powerful standing army to maintain order. This structure enabled rapid coordination across great distances, ensuring that central authority could be projected consistently throughout its extensive territories. You imagine Assyrian governors stationed across distant cities, maintaining communication through messengers and written records carried along established routes. The system is highly structured, yet constantly, under pressure from the vast scale it must coordinate. Control becomes both precise and demanding, requiring continuous attention across long distances and varied regional conditions. Despite its strength, even this system cannot escape the broader cycle of expansion and strain. As territories grow larger, maintaining cohesion becomes increasingly complex. Communication slows, administration stretches, and local variation increases, revealing the limits of centralized control. The same mechanisms that enable growth also gradually introduce new forms of vulnerability over time. As pressure builds, the empire relies more heavily on layered administration and organized networks of authority. Governors, scribes, and military officials work together to maintain order, yet each layer adds complexity. Stability is preserved, but only through constant adjustment, as the system adapts to distance, diversity, and the challenges of scale. And so you remain in this quiet stage of continuity, where empires continue to function, but the edges begin to shift. Everything still moves forward, yet beneath the surface the rhythm of history reveals itself as cyclical, like a tide that never stops returning in different forms across time and space. You continue your final steps through the long river of history, where empires no longer feel like living things, but like memories slowly dissolving back into the earth. Hello again. Tonight you arrive at the quiet end of everything, where movement slows and even time itself feels ready to rest. The great cities you have walked through now feel distant. Uruk, Babylon, and many others no longer stand as living centers of power. Instead, they rest beneath layers of soil and silence, their names carried forward only through fragments, stories, and the patient work of later discovery. You notice how the land itself remains unchanged. Rivers still flow in their ancient paths, and winds still move across the same plains. What once held kingdoms and administrations now appears as open earth again, as if civilization had briefly written itself onto the landscape before gently fading away. The towering structures that once defined authority are no longer visible. Walls that symbolized protection and power have softened into uneven lines of stone and earth. Over time, they become indistinguishable from the terrain, blending back into the natural contours of the world. You walk across what might once have been a city, but now feels like a quiet field. Beneath your steps, layers of history rest unseen. Mud brick, stone, and forgotten streets lie buried below, preserved not by intention, but by the slow patience of time itself, which gradually covers all traces of past human presence. There is something deeply calm in this disappearance. Nothing here is violent or abrupt. Instead, everything returns gently to stillness, as if civilization itself had simply exhaled after a long existence and allowed the earth to close over its story. The silence that follows feels natural, like a resting phase after centuries of movement and change. New generations of people will one day build again on these same lands. They may not know the full depth of what lies beneath them, yet they continue. The same cycle of settlement, growth, and transformation. Life does not stop here. It simply continues in new forms, shaped by changing needs and evolving ways of living over time. You begin to understand how history is not a straight line, but a layered rhythm. Cities rise, expand, and eventually fade, yet the conditions that made them possible remain. Geography, water, and human need continue to shape where life gathers and reorganizes itself, repeating patterns that stretch across long spans of human existence. The idea of permanence slowly dissolves as you observe this cycle. What once felt like powerful empires now appears temporary in comparison to the endurance of land and river. Everything built by human hands eventually returns to the same quiet foundation, where nature and time continue their steady, uninterrupted presence beneath all change. Even memory becomes fragile over time. Names of rulers, laws, and cities survive only through fragments of writing or later rediscovery. Without excavation and careful interpretation, much of this world would remain buried and silent, resting beneath layers of earth, waiting patiently. Beneath the surface of modern understanding, hidden from awareness yet still present in form. You notice how silence here is not emptiness, but presence without expression. The land is full, yet no longer speaking in the language of cities or organized life. It holds everything quietly, like a vast archive that does not need to be read in order to exist, preserving traces of human civilization without active voice or movement. Time itself feels different in this final movement. It no longer appears as a sequence of events, but as a continuous flow where beginnings and endings are no longer clearly separated. Instead, everything blends into a steady passage forward, as if history itself has softened into a single, uninterrupted rhythm stretching across generations and landscapes. Everything merges into this slow continuity, where change is no longer marked by clear breaks or transitions. Civilizations rise and fade, yet the underlying flow remains constant. In this perspective, time becomes less about moments and more about movement itself, carrying all things gently forward into an endless, quiet unfolding of existence. Historically, many ancient cities such as Ur and Nineveh were eventually abandoned due to political change, environmental shifts, or gradual decline. Over time, they were left uninhabited and slowly buried by wind, sand, and sediment. What once were thriving centers of administration, trade, and culture gradually disappeared from daily human memory, becoming part of the silent landscape. They were later rediscovered through archaeological excavation carried out in modern times, revealing entire worlds that had once functioned as active centers of civilization. Beneath layers of earth, researchers uncovered temples, palaces, written records, and everyday objects, offering detailed insight into societies long gone. These discoveries transformed forgotten ruins into valuable windows into early human history. You imagine archaeologists carefully uncovering these places, brushing away dust that has settled for millennia. Each artifact emerges slowly from the earth, carrying a quiet message from a world long gone. These fragments offer gentle glimpses of daily life, belief systems, and social structures that once felt solid, active, and deeply permanent in their own time. Yet, even in their rediscovery, these cities do not return to life. They remain fragments, partial reconstructions of something that once existed in full. Pottery, tablets, and broken walls suggest continuity, but never completeness. What is recovered is always incomplete, like hearing a distant echo that hints at a much larger, now silent presence. You begin to see that power, no matter how vast, always belongs to a temporary moment in time. Empires rise, organize, and eventually dissolve, shaped by conditions that change slowly and inevitably. The ground beneath them remains unchanged, holding layer upon layer of forgotten histories without judgment, quietly preserving everything that once passed above it. Across these layers, time feels less like a line and more like accumulation. Civilizations do not vanish completely. They settle into the earth, becoming part of a deeper foundation. Each generation builds upon what came before, often unaware of how much of the past still rests beneath their feet, shaping the surface they inhabit. Standing in this final silence, you notice everything that was once built has already returned, to rest beneath time's gentle cover. The river still flows, the land still breathes, and time continues its slow and steady movement forward, as it always has, without urgency or end, carrying all moments softly into the same quiet continuity. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.